So I'm going to hand over now to my colleague, Emma Farrell, and Emma will tell us from her perspective a little bit about Thinkful. So Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Shane. And it's lovely to see so many faces and friends join us today for this launch. And it's great to have you all here. We were just chatting 2 minutes before coming on about how long it's been in the making, how long Thinkful has been coming down the line. And for me, really, it's been 16 years or so in the making, and really goes back to when I was involved in setting up what's now known as Jigsaw, or Ireland's National Centre for Youth Mental Health. Our first 10 years, the tagline was changing how Ireland thinks about youth mental health. And this was in recognition that not only did we need change in our services and how we approached young people when they were struggling, and in that case, Jigsaw was very much about moving from our standard tertiary psychiatric response to distress to a much more community-based, free and accessible form of support for young people. But that we also needed a change of mind, a change in our thinking, that the ways we were approaching and thinking about mental health weren't quite working for us. And I'm sure many of us have come across people who have experienced distress and just found the illness narrative quite constricting or quite limiting, or for whom the standard cause and effect scientific frameworks just didn't fit their experiences and what was going on for them. So there's been many people and many colleagues I've worked with in mental health throughout the years who've said, we know we need to think about this differently. We know we need to rethink this, do something more, try and do things better. But then there's always been this kind of full stop. We've been a little bit stuck for what happens next, what kind of ideas, conversations, words, frameworks, and ways of engaging with ideas might fill that space. And I'm absolutely going to usurp the great Irish poet Evan Boland and say, for me, philosophy began where certainty ended. And it was by studying philosophy and making the move back to academia that I got to access and engage with friends and colleagues' ideas, theories, languages, and ways of really approaching the messiness and the uncertainty and difficulties of reality in a completely different way. And so for me, Thinkful comes from that place, that desire to have something for after the full stop, and to try and make the ideas that so many colleagues here today engage with so helpfully available to those who might most benefit from them. And that's when I met Anya. I'll hand over to Anya to pick up the story from there.
There we go, on you might unmute yourself there.
Sorry. Thanks so much, Emma, and thanks so much everyone for coming along today to hear more about Thinkful. What we want to do with this project is to connect philosophy, education, and mental health. So Thinkful, it's a network of people. It's a website, it's a place to start conversations, and it's hopefully a platform where different types of writing, shorter pieces, interdisciplinary pieces, more creative pieces maybe, can find a home and an interested audience. And as Emma says, the key ambition really is to consider again the languages that are available to us in the world of mental health. And we have to be careful here, because sometimes in education, I think the words we use are very helpful and sometimes they're not. Sometimes they don't quite capture what the young person is actually experiencing. I was thinking about this the other day when a teacher I know working in my local school, Susan Andrews, who's here. Hi, Susan. She's a teacher of business, German and philosophy at Temple Carrick and Greystones. Susan showed me an essay written by one of her students. The topic of the essay was freedom. And the student had written, we use a lot of language we don't fully understand, like, for example, the term anxiety. And we use it a lot, but I haven't come across many subjects trying to help us make more sense of it. And that really brought me back to what we are doing with this project at its very simplest, which is trying to make sense. And making sense involves identifying assumptions, checking the degree to which those assumptions make sense. It involves multiple perspectives and it involves listening. So Thinkful then is about the power of philosophy, that special way philosophy has, I always think, of expanding our imaginations and our vocabularies. But it is also about philosophy in conversation with psychiatry, with psychoanalysis, with psychology, with education. The psychoanalyst Adam Phillips has said that we just never know who's going to say the interesting or the useful thing. And that really struck a chord with me. I think in the mental health world, we need to have what philosopher Richard Carney calls a hospitality of narratives. We need to be open to and welcoming of what we might learn from each other. So just to say thank you all so much for making the time to be here today. It's really great to be at this stage now, to see the network coming together and to see all of you here to support us and to share your own ideas. And I'll hand you back now to Shane, who will introduce our wonderful speakers, Professor Paul Standish and Dr. Rob Grant. Thanks, Shane.
Thank you, Anya and Emma, for your oversight on thinkful.ie. And the website is live. I'll put a link to it in the chat shortly. You can go and visit it. But we're going to hear now from two philosophers who are genuinely wonderful at making philosophy accessible to all. So first we have Professor Paul Standish. Paul is the Chair of Philosophy at University College London and President of the Philosophy of Education Society of Great Britain. I had the pleasure of meeting Paul at the conference recently. How would a physicist end up at a philosophy conference? I think we could chat about that for a little bit, but I learned so much from him and others, and it's a pleasure to introduce Paul to speak to you now. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Shane. It's very good to be here, and I'd like to thank Emma and Anya for the invitation to take part in this wonderful event. Probably what I'm going to say is going to overlap with some things that have been mentioned already, but let's just reflect on the fact that it's kind of no news that mental health is a problem in our societies today. And the fact that it's no news is itself quite significant, I think. We've become so accustomed to this rhetoric of mental health that it's kind of imbibed with us from early childhood. So we know we live in societies in which mental health is increasing, mental illness is increasing rather. There's the pandemic, there's the economic crisis, the climate crisis, Ukraine. And it seems that a new self-identity has developed around the notion of how your mental health is. Self-esteem, I think, was an early warning of this, because suddenly in schools there was great concern. Psychologists developed measures for self-esteem, and teachers worried about whether children's self-esteem was adequate or not. It was a very odd concept, because no one ever talked about anybody having too much self-esteem, perhaps until Donald Trump came along and that shifted the ground a little bit. But generally it was an odd notion, and one where measurements didn't seem appropriate. So this seems to be a new lifestyle marker, how we think about our mental health. So it's commonplace for footballers to talk about their mental health, to cry on TV, for royalty to refer to this, and for TV commentators almost to speak of it as de rigueur in every program. There are endless makeover programs on TV about improving your weight or your clothing or your cooking or your house and its condition, or selling things to get something new to gradually reform who you are and what surrounds you. And something in all this is surely a little bit mad, so that these purported cures, these treatments themselves seem to be symptoms of something that we should be concerned about. This is exacerbated by the madness of social media, indeed new forms of madness, in which a respectable and decent politics of recognition has turned into a kind of inflamed narcissism, something we should worry about, I think. And with this, of course, there is the new normalization, the hyper-normalization, which comes with neoliberalism. Well, education's part of this scene, isn't it? Education is both a contributor to some of these problems, and also it's a manifestation of them. So, of course, teachers are understandably concerned with children showing stress over examinations, with the ways in which competition seems to affect young people perhaps more than before, and the way this is managed in school and other educational contexts, with peer pressure, with new forms of school refusal, what the Japanese called hikikomori, a strange kind of withdrawal affecting boys, I think, more than girls, and going on not just through school years, but into the 20s and 30s, a withdrawal from society. The pandemic makes those presents worse and perhaps brings out something that was latent in our modern culture in any case. So what response do we find? Well, let's look at what education does, because one way we've responded is to see education as a solution, education as a source of therapy. And so we have happiness classes promoted especially by the very, very eloquent but rather too confident Anthony Seldon in many respects in his own school. And then we have, and permeating other schools as well, happiness classes. We have ways to de-stress being taught to students, emotional self-management, and then life planning, things that seem in many respects very sensible, but actually alter the way in which a young person is encouraged to see their life, not as something that gradually unfolds, something in which contingency is operating, but something that must be mapped and projected at every turn. We have early forms of diagnosis of those at risk, new diagnoses, new pathologies, and that again involves the mapping of the curriculum and of the child themselves. So these additions to the curriculum, in some ways, they're actually keeping things going in the same way. In some ways, they're furthering the problems we're concerned about. So why has that happened? Well, one answer, I think, is that education itself stands in need of some kind of therapy. Education has gone a bit mad with its obsession with achievement, with performance indicators, with statistical information and statistics provided to fill databases and spreadsheets, rather than to address the real problems that children and young people face. Of course, this is manifest in education, in the assessment systems that actually work retrospectively on the construction of the curriculum, because you work out what you want for the assessment system, and that'll usually be heavily driven by concern with quantifiable factors. And then you construct a curriculum that will produce the required kinds of tests that produce those statistics. So that affects the way the curriculum is constructed. It affects the way the teacher understands her task and the student understands what he's to learn. This then is a culture of competition and accountability, which itself is pathological in certain respects, a culture of achievement. And I'd like to say just in passing that I think educational research itself is susceptible to this, because it's become so driven by its own performance indicators, its own drive to provide evidence on which policy can be based. And research funding, of course, exacerbates that matter. Educational research doesn't have to be like that. There is research in the humanities, philosophy, of course, included, which is powerful and important in addressing the things we're talking about. Now, about 15 years ago, I was involved in the publication of a book called The Therapy of Education. And I think that covers some of the ground that we're concerned with here. So I'd just like to say a little bit about it. There's a double genitive in the title, isn't there? Because it could be the ways in which education provides therapy, education in the subject position there, or with education in the object position, the ways that education stands in need of therapy. And in that book, my colleagues and I, that's to say Paul Smeyers and Richard Smith, were trying, I think, to deconstruct a number of pairs of relationship here between therapy and education, between education and philosophy, and between philosophy and therapy. Now, I don't think we used the word deconstruct in doing this because it was something of a postmodern dirty word at the time. So we carefully avoided that. But what deconstruction would mean here is not there's a project of collapsing these distinctions between therapy and education, or philosophy and therapy, and so on, but rather of seeing that there are aspects of one that, as it were, seep beneficially into the other and vice versa. And there's a tendency in both to shore themselves up in ways that exclude that interrelationship or hold it back in certain respects. If I take the relation between therapy and education as a starting point, we've already seen, or at least I've criticized, some of those therapeutic measures that have been introduced in schools, which I think actually are miseducative and part of the problem, the happiness classes and so on. If I take the relation between education and philosophy, and let's think of philosophy of education, which is after all my main role in life, then philosophy of education itself, I think, is misconceived because it's sometimes thought of as philosophy applied to the practice of education. And in the past, that sometimes generated a kind of top-down approach where the wise philosopher works out the principles and then the others put this into practice. And I don't support that. But I also don't support it because I think any decent conception of education has an element of philosophy as practical reason live in that practice. live in that practice, not just in the actual standing in the classroom and doing things with children, where the alert thinker, the alert teacher should be sensitized to multiple philosophical aspects to what they are doing, but also in the reflection on how to educate, what it is to educate, what human beings should become, what one should do with one's life. So I think the applied notion is very limited. But I also think it's a mistake to think of philosophy of education as a branch of education. And this is where the deconstruction comes in, because in fact, education is there at the heart of the central, commonly thought of as central aspects of philosophy, such as epistemology and ethics. And for goodness sake, Rousseau knew this well enough, Plato knew this well enough, Confucius knew this. It's there at the heart and at the start of philosophy. Education is an odd category in this respect. And finally, philosophy and therapy. Well, serious-minded academic analytical philosophers in particular have tended to shore up philosophy in a way that would insulate it from its more therapeutic functions, seeing that as perhaps a popular version of what the word means, what philosophy means. But again, a therapeutic aspect of philosophy goes back to ancient ideas of, as I've already said, how I should live my life, what the good society is, and ideas sometimes referred to as the care of the self. That phrase, taken up in the last century so much by Pierre Hadot and by Michel Foucault, is very significant and pertinent to our situation, because Foucault's use of that term, and especially the interpretation of Foucault's writings about the care of the self, have, I think, tended to distort what the ancient notion involved, because they've turned it towards a kind of excessively introspective consideration of what a self is, or something like that. The better version involves a turning outwards and attending to what is beyond the self, and an avoidance of that narcissistic introspection, as I've just referred to. In this respect, I think we can be quite precise about what is needed. And that is that although education in the sciences is of great importance, it's perhaps not of such great importance as education in the humanities. Of course, what I'm saying goes counter to the current drift of policy and practice around the world. But there is something fundamental about the humanities in the sense that they do, in some way or other, look at questions of how human beings find meaning or make meaning in their lives. This isn't just true with regard to, for example, the reading of literature. It's true in relation to history, because history is never just an account of a sequence of physical events. It always is contextualized, is given sense by the sense that those involved made of what they were doing and the reflections that have happened since those events on their significance. So meaning making or making sense seems to be crucial to the human condition. The humanities are the ways in which that has been focused, that concern has been focused through education. The humanities can consider what the value of science is. Science can't consider what the value of science is. That would be to step outside science for all its immense worth. Now, I think a lot of what I've been talking about is actually there in print already. And one place in which it is there recently in print is the excellent special issue of the Journal of Philosophy of Education, which Emma Williams has headed. And I know Emma has been involved in collaborating with Emma Farrell and Anya in the course of the development of Thinkful and the earlier work that Emma Farrell was talking about before. So I do commend to you that special issue and hope it will feed into some of the ideas that develop through Thinkful. I'd like to turn next, though, to another aspect of education, which I think is worthy of attention now, and it's to do with education's relation to difficulty and struggle, which I believe Emma Farrell was talking about to some extent earlier on. My take on this would be to follow the Greek proverb, which runs mathein, pathein, pathein, mathein. And that means to learn is to suffer is to learn. And we get some very stern accounts of education in Nietzsche's, for example, Nietzsche's account. But I want to put the focus on something slightly different. I think there's a tendency now towards the desirability of a pain-free learning, which will yield quicker and quicker results. We want learning constructed in such a way that it will reduce stress. where there'll be clear paths to success, clearly transparent learning outcomes with criteria for meeting those outcomes made plain to all students so that they know from what's on the tin what's inside the education they sign up for. Now, there's something to my mind that is fatally reductivist about that. There's also something that encourages a certain kind of quick-witted learner who will pick out what they've got to learn and move through the system very quickly and get good results. And maybe that learner will carry on doing that all the way through their career, through their research degree, through their professional degree, professional career afterwards. Well, I perhaps won't be the only person who refers to this book, a book by William Dereshowitz, which came out, I think, in 2015, called Excellent Sheep. And in that book, Dereshowitz looks at elite universities in the United States. And what he's struck by is the ways in which those who do well in these universities have patterns of achievement following on achievement, achievement in everything they put their hand to, not just straight A's, but excellence in the debating competition, excellence in sport, in music, in the arts. They achieve at everything that they are doing. And that's what they're there for, to achieve. In the end, according to Dereshowitz, there's something missing, something absent in these lives that have been constructed out of this education, successful as they are. And that what is missing, I think, is intimately tied up with this pattern, with this possibility of failure, of things going wrong in our lives. So I recommend the book to you. Dereshowitz is lamenting this, and he sometimes gestures towards Thoreau and Emerson, as in the 19th century, providing a different vision of what education might be, a hospitality of narratives, incidentally, in the way that Anya was saying just now. I sometimes wonder with these Excellent Sheep how they would read a line that Emma Williams has quoted and Adam Phillips has quoted and Stanley Cavell has from Samuel Beckett. Use your head, can't you? Use your head. You're on Earth. There's no cure for that. And Adam Phillips, Emma Williams, and so on, they're very struck by this line because it seems to touch humorously, that dark humor that we get from Beckett, it touches humorously on something that defies all these measures, these forms of planning, these diagnoses, and so on. I'm going to end on a slightly different note. Heidegger picked up some of those themes that Emerson and Thoreau wrote about, picked them up indirectly perhaps, but via Nietzsche undoubtedly was influenced. Heidegger also has written about something like mindfulness, and there are books published with his name on in connection with that. And one thing that Heidegger says in the course of all this is to talk about the nature of thinking and how something's been lost from thinking itself, something which is there and evident in the etymology of the word, where think connects with thank. And both Emerson, avant la lettre as it were, and Heidegger talk about the possibility of thinking as thanking, a kind of receptiveness, a kind of hospitality of thought in ways that we've mostly lost. And that idea then that thinking should be thanking, that we should be thankful for thinking, seems an appropriate thought on which to end talking here by me about Thinkful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul, for that Beckett-like ending. What a wonderful close to that conversation. I'm struck by the conversations that we had before the meeting began today, jokingly talking about the recent QS rankings and you know, about the absurdity that goes with much of that. Indeed, in Ireland at the moment, our second level students are engaging what we call the Leaving Certificate. Many on the call here will know what I'm talking about. And it's a time of year when media seem to go mad about the acquisition of points and grades in education, and everything else seems to hinge around that point. So I'm excited to think about how platforms like Thinkful and indeed the journal you referred to in that book also can help to shape the conversations that we genuinely need to have about those important issues. So thank you again, Paul, for that. I'm going to next invite Dr. Rob Grant to say a few words. Rob is the co-founder of the philosophical dialogue project, hearlisten.ie. Over to you, Rob. Thank you.
Thank you, Shane. And thank you, everyone. It's great to be here, and congratulations to Anya and Emma on the launch of this project. I'm really delighted to see it come to fruition, and I can think of no two better people, more caring and capable people to see it come to reality and to nurture it as it progresses. So I run a project called Here Listen, as Shane said, and it's a philosophical dialogue project. And what we do, and what we've been doing for the past 4 or 5 years, is we bring philosophy into communities, particularly marginalized and oppressed communities, but not exclusively, into schools, primary schools, secondary schools. We've run projects in Mountjoy Prison. We have a long-running partnership with the Rialto Community Project, where we've run philosophical dialogue groups with community workers, with young people, with youth workers in rehab groups. And so I suppose I noticed on the Thinkful website, there was a mention about philosophy's unique mode of approach. And just to preface what this project does is it takes a slightly different approach to philosophy than maybe the traditional academic approach to it. And it views philosophy as a activity, as a practice. And what that means is we literally get together on a weekly basis, we gather a group of people, and we turn towards and explore different philosophical questions and issues. And, you know, it's face-to-face, it's real time, and it's a spontaneous exploration of these ideas. And I recently just finished up a project in Rialto, and I just want to talk a little bit about some of the feedback that I got on that project. And maybe that might speak perhaps to why this kind of space and this kind of practice is something that's needed in our public life, and something that really connects with the mission of thinkful.ie. And this was with a group of kids. There was 3 different groups. Some were the age of 10 to 12, some were 14 to 15. They were from the Dublin 8 Rialto community. Most of them had never heard of philosophy before. And we ran a 10-week project where we met weekly and we engaged in conversation about things like cruelty, weakness, technology, beauty. And it went really well. You know, people showed up every week and gave their time voluntarily. And when we had the feedback session, what came up time and time again from these young people was that there's nowhere else to have these types of conversations. This is the only place we can have these types of conversations. And I remember one kid saying, if I brought up these subjects at home, I'd be laughed out of the house. Another kid said, if I tried to talk to my teacher about this stuff, I'd get in trouble. And I also ran a project with What Does He Need, which is exploring masculinity with young boys and men. And we ran a series of philosophical dialogues, and the same feedback came up. It was like, we can't have these conversations with our friends. And so that was encouraging for me to hear that we're creating a space that doesn't really exist. But if we assume for a moment that philosophy and meaning making, as Paul pointed out, is a human activity, is a natural thing that occurs to humans, philosophical questions, then the real question that came up for me is, why can't we have these types of conversations in other places? Why are there not spaces for these conversations in our education system, in our workplace, sometimes in our home life, sometimes if we're lucky they are, but among our friends? And this is what led me to thinking about a theme that has come up several times already today, which I'm really delighted to hear. And it's to do with our cultural ability to turn towards and face into difficulty and complexity. And I think part of, like, there's lots of reasons why these conversations don't fit into our cultural spaces these days. There's questions of our techno, digital, consumerist, capitalist culture where efficiency and productivity are the only values. And so there's no space for these more philosophical, reflective questions. But I think on a deeper level, there is a uncomfortableness that people have with facing towards difficult, complex questions. And I think if there's one thing that defines philosophical questions, it's the fact that they're difficult, complex, ambiguous, subtle, nuanced. They generate contradiction and paradox. And this can leave people, when they're facing into those things, very frustrated. These questions exist on the edge of our understanding. They're the limits of our understanding. They're the limits of our linguistic abilities. It's very difficult to put these things into words. And so what happens when we face into that is people get frustrated, overwhelmed, intimidated, and maybe they even feel stupid when they can't understand it. And so this really embodied sense of frustration is a very real thing. And, you know, it leads people to recoil, to retreat, to turn away from these questions, to laugh at them, to dismiss them, to say to people, why are you always talking about this kind of stuff? To not make space for these type of questions. And we tend to retreat into the safety and security of certainty. We tend to reduce our beliefs into simplified belief systems because it's safe. And the desire for certainty is certainly very compelling and it's very understandable. But it's one of the ways in which I can describe our project in Here Listen is the practice of turning towards difficulty and staying with it. John Keats, the poet, calls this negative capability, the capacity to stay with mystery, uncertainty, and doubt without any irritable reaching after fact and reason. And this is why in our groups, when I'm facilitating them, I spend very little time talking about thinking skills, critical thinking skills, logical analysis, logical fallacies. All I really ask of people who come to participate in these sessions is that you try and listen to what comes up. Because I think within the posture of listening, if you bring a listening posture and attitude towards these, you bring a certain presence and a certain openness with you that you can allow these difficult and complex questions to reveal themselves as fully as possible without trying to reduce them, organize them, categorize them, and fit them into reductive shapes and definitions and theories. So what you're asking people to do is simply to bear witness to the unveiling of the rich complexity of these topics. You're not asking them to reduce them and walk away with a solution to what is beauty, to what is technology, to whether technology is good for humans. You're just asking them to witness the complexity as it reveals itself. And what I've found, and what has never failed to be the case, no matter what group I work with or what age, is that when you bring a listening, present attitude towards these kind of questions, insightful thoughts and ideas bubble up. They bubble up from us when we bring that kind of attention. They just occur to us. And so there's never a problem with generating ideas in a dialogue. And I've seen time and time again, we present a quote or an idea from a philosopher to stimulate the conversation, and people will react and recoil and say, that doesn't make any sense to me. That's wrecking my head. That's really confusing. That's frustrating. And you ask them to just stay with it. And eventually an hour and a half has passed where you've had a really meaningful conversation about something. And I think this is where Here Listen and Thinkful have a real overlap and connection here, because I know Emma and Anya take this idea really seriously, this idea of how we culturally and as a society face towards difficulty. And I think listening is really, really important here. And I just want to end on an idea about listening from an Italian philosopher and psychoanalyst who listening is not really dealt with philosophically too much. Heidegger talks about it quite a bit. But Gemma Corradi Fiumara wrote a book on listening, and she makes the point that you know, we assume that the adult listens to the child because the child speaks. But she says instead, perhaps it's the case that the child speaks because the adult listens. So it's possible that listening should come first, not as a reaction to meaningful dialogue, but as a precondition for meaningful dialogue. And so when we create spaces where we take people seriously and take their ideas seriously and listen to them, then we develop this capacity to stay with difficulty and complexity. And, you know, whether or not this is not therapy, this is a philosophical, conceptual analysis, it's a linguistic endeavor, but it can be therapeutic. And there's different forms of difficulty, of course, when it comes to mental health, emotional, embodied, affective difficulty and distress that's of a different form than philosophical difficulty. But I still think the practice of not recoiling, getting frustrated with difficulty is a really important thing that finds little space in our educational and cultural institutions that we need to create more space for. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thank you, Rob. I think we could have listened to you and indeed to Paul for a good deal longer. Indeed, Emma and I just last night were talking about that gift that is that capacity to listen. And I think that framing of listening coming first is so important. For me, I'm working as part of a group to prepare for a citizens' assembly on education in Ireland, and so much of that seems to be about where it starts. And I'd be completely with you, as in we must listen before we start talking about terms of reference and setting the scene, and for others to talk. Otherwise, it's just responding to my conceptions or indeed to someone else's. So some really rich ideas there. Thank you very much. Folks, I'm going to stop the recording now.